In August 2022, a geological survey expedition vanished in the Kassel Desert. Only one man was recovered alive. This is his account. I never planned to be alone out here. It was supposed to be a short survey. 3 days, maybe 4, mapping the stratified rock beds along the western edge of the Kassel Desert. The university had been clear. No extended expeditions without backup. But budgets were tight, and no one else volunteered. So when the permits came through and the satellite phone was tested, I told myself it was fine. That isolation had its own rhythm, and I'd always preferred working in silence. It was only when the last supply truck rattled away, its dust plume shrinking against a horizon so flat it looked painted, that I felt the first flicker of unease. The desert wasn't empty the way a forest or tundra was. It was emptier. A clean, absolute nothing that seemed to press against your thoughts until you forgot why you'd come. I spent the first day unloading equipment. The camp was simple: a canvas shelter, a folding cot, and a field lab set up inside a modular crate. My water tanks lined the southern wall, where the shade would last longest. I staked a bright orange flag at the highest dune nearby. If I got disoriented, I could always return by sight. Or that was the theory. The work started well enough. The northern canyon walls exposed perfect layers: mudstone, limestone, thin seams of volcanic ash that dated back millions of years. I photographed every stratum, labeled each sample, and logged coordinates on my handheld GPS. When the sun fell, I retreated to the shelter, heat still radiating off the sand in long, invisible waves. The first night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes only when you're miles from anyone who can need something from you. It was the second night that woke me. I couldn't say what stirred me at first. No sound, no movement, just the sense that something waited past the walls of the shelter, watching. I lay still, one hand on my chest to feel my own heartbeat. The darkness inside the canvas seemed thicker than before, layered. When I reached for my lantern, the battery indicator glowed a steady green, but the bulb flickered when I switched it on. A brief strobe of light illuminated the inside of the shelter: cot, gear crates, my boots where I'd left them. And then the bulb steadied. Nothing moved. I told myself it was fatigue. Long days in the sun played tricks on the senses. I drank some water, lay back down, and forced my eyes shut. But sleep didn't return easily. At dawn, I stepped outside and scanned the camp perimeter. My footprints from the day before were still crisp. No new tracks, no sign of disturbance. By mid-morning, the heat climbed to brutal levels. My thermometer read 46 degrees Celsius. I worked slowly, retreating to the thin strip of shade whenever my pulse grew too fast. That evening, I logged my samples and tried the satellite phone. The connection pulsed twice and dropped. No signal. I tried again. Nothing. I wasn't worried yet. The signal sometimes drifted this far from the main plateau. I'd planned to check in every other day anyway. When night came, I ate a meal bar and studied my maps. There was a section of the canyon I'd marked as potentially unstable. My plan was to photograph it in the morning, then start the slow loop back toward the depot. I told myself it would be fine. Just one more day, one more set of measurements. I lay down, the air in the shelter still hot enough to sting my throat. My eyelids grew heavy. But as I drifted toward sleep, I thought I saw something move across the canvas, just the barest shift of shadow, a shape that paused as though deciding whether to enter. I waited, breath held. Nothing came. I closed my eyes, willing the image away. But some part of me knew it would return. I woke before sunrise, my mouth so dry I could hardly swallow. The air inside the shelter was cold, the chill that settles just before the first heat of the day. I sat up slowly, every joint stiff from hours on the thin cot. For a few moments I listened, straining past the blood in my ears for any sound outside. Nothing. No wind, no footsteps, no reason to feel the tightness in my chest. I pulled on my boots and stepped into the dawn. The desert stretched away in all directions, the sand tinted lavender under the pale sky. My orange marker flag still fluttered on the dune. Nothing moved but the slow drift of grit across my boot tops. It should have felt reassuring, but it didn't. I forced myself to begin the day's work. The canyon was only a kilometer east, a shallow cut through layered rock that had once been a riverbed. As I walked, the sun climbed, bleaching the world until the shadows shrank to knife-edge slivers. I kept my pace steady, though my head already throbbed with the first edge of dehydration. Every hour I paused to drink, rationing what I carried. By the time I reached the canyon rim, sweat soaked my collar. The drop below was deeper than I'd expected, maybe 20 meters to the floor. The walls were streaked with color, thin bands of pink and ochre and gray. Beautiful. Empty. I set up my camera and began photographing each layer in sequence. The quiet felt absolute. A silence so complete that I caught myself holding my breath. Halfway through the survey, I noticed something that didn't belong. On the canyon floor, just visible where the shadows pooled deepest, a series of parallel lines scored the rock. 4 straight grooves, perfectly spaced, as if something heavy had been dragged across the stone. I zoomed in. The marks extended 10, maybe 15 meters, vanishing beneath a spill of loose sediment. I told myself it was an old excavation, maybe a mining cart or a survey sled. But the lines were too crisp, too recent. I took a dozen photos, logged the coordinates, and packed up faster than I intended. My hands shook as I collapsed the tripod. The walk back to camp felt longer.
The heat pressed against my shoulders, each step an effort to keep moving when every instinct urged me to turn and check the canyon again. When I reached the shelter, I tried the satellite phone. The screen flickered, then went black. I checked the battery pack. Still charged. No damage I could see. I cycled the power again and again, but nothing changed. Finally, I set it down and pressed both palms to my eyes. The thought rose unbidden. It doesn't want you to call. I swallowed, my throat raw. The desert did things to the mind. Fatigue, dehydration, heat, all combined to erode your certainty. I told myself that was all this was. I spent the afternoon cataloging samples, working methodically to keep my thoughts pinned in place. The routine helped. I measured grain sizes, logged mineral content, labeled each plastic bag with careful, even handwriting. As the sun fell, I stepped outside to watch the last light fade from the dunes. That was when I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was a reflection, sunlight bouncing off quartz or some trick of atmosphere. But the glow held steady. 3 pale points arranged in a line on the horizon. Too high to be campfires, too motionless to be aircraft. I stood there for a long time, squinting against the glare. They didn't move, didn't flicker. Eventually, the darkness swallowed them. I went back inside, hands trembling. I didn't light the lantern that night. I lay on the cot in darkness, listening to the wind push fine sand against the canvas in soft hisses. I must have drifted near sleep, because when I opened my eyes, the glow had returned. This time, closer. 3 perfect points shining against the shelter wall. No shadows, no source I could see. I sat up, breath tight in my throat. The lights vanished. I waited, listening. My heartbeat felt loud enough to shake the cot, but the darkness remained ordinary. I lay back down and closed my eyes. Sleep came in fits, each dream threaded with the same image, a canyon floor scored by lines that never ended, and lights that watched without blinking. When dawn came, I felt older than the day before, and I knew, in a quiet place I couldn't name, that I couldn't stay here much longer. At sunrise, I forced myself to pack the samples and recheck my equipment. The phone still refused to power on. The battery meter glowed green, the screen stayed black. I'd worked with enough field gear to know when something was broken. But this felt different, like a decision had been made somewhere beyond my reach. I stepped outside and scanned the dunes. No lights, no movement. Just the wind combing long ripples across the sand. The quiet pressed against my eardrums until I wanted to shout. I turned back to the camp and froze. My orange marker flag, so bright against the dunes, was gone. I stared, waiting for my eyes to adjust or my mind to catch up. But the dunes stood bare, no trace of the thin pole or the strip of fabric I'd staked there 2 days before.
I walked up the slope, boots slipping in the soft crust. At the crest, I scanned every angle. Nothing. No fragments, no prints. The wind could bury things, sure, but it wouldn't erase them this cleanly overnight. My pulse climbed in my throat. I returned to camp and did the only thing that made sense. I started packing. Methodical, precise. Every sample bag, every tool, every scrap of gear went into the crates. I worked until sweat ran cold down my spine, until there was nothing left to do. When I was finished, I stood with my hands on my hips, staring at the shelter. It looked smaller now, fragile, like it might vanish the moment I turned my back. The canyon waded east, the depot southwest. I knew which way I should go, back to the depot, back to safety. But something in the canyon felt unfinished. The lines in the stone, the lights, the sense that someone or something waited to see if I would look closer. I told myself it was foolishness, that survival meant leaving. But as I started west, my boots refused to carry me more than 10 steps before stopping. I turned east. The canyon rim burned in the early sun, pale rock and endless shadow. I walked that way. Each hour grew hotter. The dunes blurred at the edges, heat waves shimmering so the horizon danced like water. I rationed my sips carefully, but thirst swelled anyway, a slow panic in the back of my throat. When I reached the canyon lip, I set down my pack and crouched. The lines on the floor were still there. Only now, they'd lengthened. The grooves extended almost the full width of the channel, disappearing under the rock shelf on the far side. I knew they hadn't been that long yesterday, or any day before. I sat back on my heels, heart thudding. I considered turning around, walking back to camp, pretending I'd never seen any of it. But I knew I wouldn't. Instead, I unpacked the climbing rope, secured it to a weathered anchor bolt, and began the slow descent. Halfway down, my boot slipped on a layer of loose grit. My shoulder slammed into the wall. For a second, I dangled, legs flailing. My breath ripped out in a single shout that bounced off the canyon walls and came back sounding wrong, warped, too high. When I found my footing again, I swallowed the taste of fear and continued. The canyon floor was colder than I expected. The air tasted different, wet, almost metallic. My boots crunched over fine gravel as I followed the grooves. Each step felt like trespassing. At the far wall, the grooves vanished under a low overhang. A thin crevice gaped in the stone, just wide enough to squeeze through. I knelt and peered inside. A space opened beyond. Not large, maybe 3 meters across, but carved into the walls were shallow indentations, shapes that looked too regular to be erosion. Circles inside circles, spirals, a single line of symbols that matched the ones I'd seen in the canyon the first evening. I shivered, though the air was warm. I didn't enter the gap. Not then.
Instead, I climbed back to the rim, heart hammering. When I reached the top, the world looked unchanged. The dunes, the sky, the emptiness. But as I turned back to collect my pack, my stomach lurched. The camp was gone. I blinked, willing the vision to steady, but the place where the shelter had stood was bare sand. No canvas, no crates, no footprints, nothing. I took a step forward, then another. It wasn't possible. I'd only been away for an hour, 2 at most. My breath came in ragged pulls. I turned in a slow circle. The canyon waited behind me, the same as it had been for centuries. Ahead, the dunes shimmered in the heat. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe I was disoriented, that maybe the wind. But the truth pressed up from somewhere deeper. Something had taken it. I closed my eyes, willing my thoughts to slow. When I opened them, the emptiness remained. I was alone. And whatever waited in the canyon was no longer content to watch. I stood at the canyon rim staring at the empty dunes where my camp should have been. The winds stirred a thin veil of sand across the flat, erasing any last trace of footprints. My throat closed. For the first time since arriving, I felt something close to panic. Cold, bright, and absolute. I forced myself to breathe, to think. Survival first. The depot lay southwest, at least 2 days of walk with no water resupply. Even if I started now, the odds were slim. The satchel at my hip held a single bottle, half full, and a few tools. Nothing else. The canyon waited behind me. The gap in the rock, with its impossible symbols and the cool, still air that seemed to call. I told myself it was madness to go back down, that the only rational choice was to keep moving west, to try for the depot before nightfall. But my boots turned anyway. I clipped the rope to my harness with trembling hands. The descent felt longer this time. My arms shook as I rappelled, the grit raining down every time I disturbed a ledge. When my boots touched the canyon floor, I hesitated, staring at the dark seam in the far wall. It felt like crossing a threshold I would never return from. I ducked under the overhang. The crevice swallowed me in shadow, the temperature dropping a few degrees. I had to turn sideways, shoulders brushing cold stone on either side. After 3 meters, the passage widened into a low chamber. I raised my flashlight. The beam caught on smooth walls, etched with dozens of shallow carvings, spirals, nested circles, lines that bent at impossible angles. Some shapes I recognized from the first evening, others I'd never seen. My breath clouded in the cold.
Near the floor, a cluster of symbols had been filled with a dark pigment, rust or something older. My eyes traced them, unable to look away. I stepped closer. The air shifted. A slow exhale, as if the chamber itself were breathing. My pulse stuttered. I swung the light across the floor, searching for some crack or vent, but the stone was unbroken. I swallowed, my throat painfully dry.
A narrow alcove opened on the far side of the chamber. Inside, something lay draped in a sheet of coarse canvas. My stomach tightened. I didn't want to see what waited underneath, but I knew I would look. I crossed the chamber and crouched. My gloved fingers pinched the edge of the cloth and peeled it back. A crate rested beneath, wooden, weathered. The lid split along one seam. The sides were stenciled with faded letters. Kessel Geological Survey, 1974. My thoughts scrambled. That expedition had vanished, records incomplete, their last transmission garbled and impossible to translate. The rumor had always been that a flash flood took them. No bodies were found. I lifted the lid with both hands. Inside lay rows of sample bags, each tagged with dates and notations. A battered field notebook sat on top. I picked it up, thumbed through brittle pages. The handwriting was careful, precise, but by the final entries it degraded into uneven scrawls. They are beneath. The lights mark the way. If you follow them, you belong to them. My scalp prickled. I closed the notebook, breath shallow. I replaced the lid, covering the crate again. My hand shook as I backed away. Something shifted behind me, a soft scrape against stone. I turned, heart hammering. Nothing moved. The chamber was empty, but the air felt thicker, closer. I backed into the narrow passage, each step an effort not to break into a run. At the entrance, I paused. My flashlight beam played across the canyon floor, and for an instant I thought I saw prints in the dust. Bare feet, the toes splayed wide, each impression deeper than any human could make. I switched off the light. I couldn't look any longer. I climbed from the canyon with muscles that felt like frayed rope. Every few meters I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the crevice, but nothing followed. When I reached the rim, the sun hovered low, an ember smudged across a flat sky. My legs folded under me, and I sat in the sand, chest heaving. I looked west. The depot lay out there, or maybe it wasn't. The thought that I might never leave this place pressed down until I could hardly draw breath. But somewhere behind the fear, something steadier waited. A single clear intention. I would try. I would keep moving, even if it meant walking until the sand took me. I don't know how long I sat at the canyon's edge. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretching across the dunes like dark fingers. My breathing slowed to something that didn't quite feel like relief, more like surrender. When I finally stood, my legs shuddered under my weight. My throat was raw, lips cracked. The last of my water sloshed in the bottle, too little to matter. I turned west. The depot lay somewhere beyond the horizon, maybe reachable if I started now, if the night stayed calm. My eyes drifted east, toward the canyon mouth. Even in fading light, the gap yawned black, as though it swallowed the last glow of day. I thought of the crate, the notebook, the lines scrawled in a hand that ended here. They are beneath. The lights marked the way. I closed my eyes. My mind offered explanations in a weary litany, delirium, exhaustion, tricks of sun and salt. but none of them felt honest. I took a single step toward the canyon, then stopped. Survival wasn't in that direction. No answer waited there that I could carry home. Only something that wanted to be seen. I turned my back on the canyon and walked west. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the sand conspired to hold me in place, but I kept moving, boots crunching across the crust. My shadow stretched ahead, thin, wavering. Dusk turned to night. The first stars blinked alive overhead. Cold rose from the ground, soaking into my legs. I watched the horizon for any sign of lights, campfires, vehicles, anything. But the darkness remained unbroken. When my knees finally buckled, I didn't fight the collapse. I sank into the sand, pressing my cheek to its chill surface. For a moment, the relief was almost sweet. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the lights had returned. 3 points, pale and unwavering, arranged in a line across the dunes. Closer now, so close I could make out the faint shimmer around their edges, as if they were not simply lights, but openings. I told myself not to look, that to acknowledge them was to invite something I couldn't dismiss again. But my gaze fixed on the nearest glow. My heartbeat slowed, a dull thud in my ears. The light pulsed, once, twice, in rhythm with my breath. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 20. When I looked again, they were gone. The darkness returned, complete. I lay there shivering until I could gather the will to stand. The stars overhead blurred. A dull ache bloomed behind my eyes. When I rubbed them, my fingertips came away dark, rust-red smudges I didn't remember earning. I started walking again. Hours blurred past. My thoughts drifted, looping the same questions I couldn't answer. What the lights were, what they wanted, if they were real at all. The dunes slowly flattened. The crust gave way to a stretch of hardpan, ancient riverbed baked to stone. And there, in the darkness, something waited. A structure. Low walls of stacked rock, half collapsed. A foundation, maybe, or an outpost abandoned before any map recorded it. I approached without deciding to, drawn by a pull I couldn't name. Up close the walls were etched with familiar marks, circles and spirals worn nearly smooth. My breath snagged. I crouched at the threshold. Inside, the sand was undisturbed. No prints, no sign of habitation, but in the center lay a shape, a bundle wrapped in faded canvas, smaller than the crate in the canyon. I knew I shouldn't touch it. I knew that nothing good waited under that cloth, but my hands moved anyway. I peeled the covering back. Beneath lay a field satchel, nearly identical to my own. The clasp bore the same stenciled letters, Kessel Geological Survey, 1974. My pulse thundered. I opened the flap. Inside were sample bags, a compass, a folded map, and at the bottom, a photograph. Edges curled, image bleached by decades. It showed a man crouched by a canyon rim, smiling up at the camera. His face was younger, thinner, but I knew it as surely as I knew my own reflection. It was me. The photograph slipped from my numb fingers. I staggered back, breath ragged. The darkness pressed closer, a weight against my skin. I turned away and ran. My boots skidded across the hardpan. The wind rose in a low moan, carrying grains of sand that hissed across my cheeks. My lungs burned, my vision blurred. I didn't look back, even when I felt the certainty that something watched from the ruin, something that had waited longer than I could imagine. When my strength finally failed, I fell to my knees. I pressed both hands to my face, and for the first time since the camp vanished, I let myself weep. When my tears finally stopped, the wind had settled. The air felt colder than before, a clean, thin chill that cut through every layer I wore. My breathing slowed, steadied. In that quiet, something inside me shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it receded, leaving only a stark clarity. I was still alive, and if I wanted that to remain true, I had to stand. I wiped my face with the back of my glove. My skin stung where the tears had dried. Slowly, I pushed myself upright. The ruined structure behind me loomed in the darkness. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, if I let my eyes search that threshold again, I might never leave it. I turned my face to the stars. They wheeled overhead, indifferent and bright. The dunes waited, vast and unbroken. The depot lay somewhere west, maybe still reachable if I kept moving. I took a step, then another. Each footfall was an act of faith, that the sand wouldn't swallow me, that the lights wouldn't return, that I hadn't already crossed some line I couldn't retreat from. The wind rose again, soft this time, brushing the last grains of heat from my skin. My limbs felt weightless, as if the desert itself had hollowed me out. I walked. The hours blurred, marked only by the ache in my legs and the rasp of my breath. When fatigue forced me to stop, I crouched behind a low ridge and closed my eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind my lids, I saw the photograph again. The man I knew was me, crouched by the canyon rim, smiling. I didn't let myself think about what it meant. I focused instead on the one truth that mattered. I was still moving. I rose before the cold could settle too deep. My knees cracked as I stood. At dawn, the sky lightened by degrees, shading from black to violet to a brittle pale gold. I crested a dune and froze. In the hollow below, a structure stood. A squat metal tower, ringed by a chain-link fence. A weather station. My heart lurched. I half stumbled, half slid down the slope. Each step felt enormous, like wading through water. When I reached the fence, my hands shook so badly I fumbled the latch twice before it gave.
Inside the compound, the door to the main cabin hung slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into a dim, dusty interior. Instruments lined the walls. Anemometers, barometers, radios. A tangle of cables snaked across the floor. I dropped to my knees beside the radio console, fumbling for the power switch. A red light winked to life. The relief was so sudden it made my vision blur. I keyed the mic with a hand that felt barely attached to my arm. "This is..." My voice broke. I swallowed. "This is Survey Technician Marcus Hall. I need assistance. Location, approximate..." I rattled off the coordinates, though my mouth felt thick and slow. "Repeat. Request immediate extraction." I released the mic and waited. Nothing. I pressed the button again, repeating the call. The same silence answered. My throat closed. The quiet felt alive. Then a burst of static crackled through the speaker. "Copy. Survey Technician Hall. Please confirm status." The voice sounded distant, warped by signal drift. But it was real. My knees buckled. I leaned against the console, breathing hard. "I'm alive. I'm alone." "Understood," the voice replied after a moment. "Remain at location. Extraction team inbound. Estimated arrival, 5 hours." 5 hours. It felt like another lifetime. I slumped against the wall, the last of my strength seeping out. I didn't care. The cold here was different, manageable. The wind was only wind. I closed my eyes. When I woke, the sun had climbed halfway up the sky. The radio crackled again. a voice confirming their approach. I staggered outside on legs that felt carved from salt. A speck appeared on the horizon, rotors beating the air, dust pluming beneath it. A helicopter, real, solid, moving toward me. I didn't wave, I didn't shout. I stood with my arms hanging at my sides, too tired for anything but the slow realization that this might actually be over. As the machine settled in a swirl of sand, a medic climbed down, her face hidden behind goggles and a mask. She approached carefully, as if I might bolt. When she reached me, she lifted the goggles. Her eyes were kind. "You made it," she said quietly. I tried to answer, but no words came. My voice was gone, left somewhere in the canyon or the darkness beneath it. She took my elbow, guiding me to the waiting door. The blades thundered overhead, washing everything in a roar that erased the last trace of silence. I climbed inside. The medic settled across from me, checking my vitals with professional efficiency. I stared past her at the dunes receding below. For a moment, I thought I saw the lights again. 3 pale points, far out on the flat, watching. I blinked, and they were gone. I didn't look for them again. The helicopter banked west, carrying me out of the emptiness. Whatever I'd left behind would stay there. And if part of it followed me, if some part of the desert had marked me, it didn't matter. I was going home.